From the Celtic tradition are these beautiful words: "Here I stand and I say a prayer." Here I stand and I say a prayer. In Luke's gospel account that we just heard, Jesus is once again teaching his disciples and us about prayer. There's a lot to say about prayer, about the necessity of prayer, about prayer's basic nature, and prayer's vital importance in our life and our humanity, that which we were created to share with God and with each other. Now, if I were to read it again, I won't, but if we were to listen carefully to this passage again, perhaps we could imagine hearing each of the two men in the story uttering something like those very words: "Here I stand and I say a prayer." We're going to take a little different look at this gospel, recognizing that both men have come to the temple to pray. It might feel easy to begin disparaging one or the other of the men for how they are presenting themselves and picturing how each one is actually offering prayer to God. But for a moment, let's try to see these two individuals as God sees them. First and foremost, let's acknowledge that they both have come to the temple to pray. They could have stayed home. They could have wandered off somewhere else. But both of them have come to the temple to pray. Let's imagine for a moment that neither of the two is actually talking to himself instead of to God, or that the other one is beating himself up with some wounding words because he sees himself in such a poor light. I'm a sinner. They both have come into the presence of God to pray. And we know that God is listening to each of them. And we trust that God would want to hear each of them say, "Here I stand and I say a prayer." This is a story about two men, a Pharisee and a tax collector, and they are men from very different worlds. But for a moment, let's not try to shove them into separate corners and start focusing on how each one is different from the other. Let's not begin to believe that one is better or worse than the other because of the way that they do present themselves in the story. Because here's the truth. God makes no distinctions between the two of them. No distinctions. Neither man is superior to the other, and neither of them is human refuse. Their prayers, like our conversations with God, are never regulated by any social or class distinctions or hierarchies. These two men, like all of us, like all other persons, have equal access to God. That's a reminder from Eugene Peterson, theologian. He reminds us also about how Luke reminds us in this gospel reading and in others that God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are always endeavoring to include all people in the same manner. Pharisee, tax collector, men, women, old, young, rich, poor, people who are sick and people who are healthy, people who are honest and people who are dishonest, those who are upright and those who are conniving, saints or sinners, people who are educated and those who are not educated. All of us are beloved persons of God, regardless of who we are, regardless of gender, religion, or any political affinities. God makes no distinctions. We are all loved. And we are all listened to. Eugene Peterson reminds us, get used to being listened to by God. I love to tell this to the men and women that I visit, especially at the jail, when they claim, and I hear it often, God isn't listening to me. Why would God want to listen to me? Why would God even want to bother with me? Surprise, beloved. God does listen to all of us, every single one of us, no matter who we are and no matter where we are coming from. Now, if we need or want to make distinctions about people and their ways of praying, our ways of praying, let's remember first that, prayer is a conversation time with God. It's a time for us to go deep with God, to dig down into ourselves, where all the prayers begin, where all those things that we want to say to God and all those things that we are hoping to hear from God start to grow. And we remember that we are speaking directly with God. A friend called me recently to say that she stopped praying. Took me nearly an hour to talk her off the ledge. She actually did most of the talking herself and came to her own conclusion that she is so busy listing all the righteous things that she does to get God to hear her, like some people would believe the Pharisee is doing, that she forgets that she's moving towards God. And by her own admission, her prayers are more directed toward herself instead of fully toward God. Now, wait a minute, you might be thinking. Didn't we hear a few minutes ago Paul listing his accomplishments in his second letter to Timothy? We sure did. But when we listen carefully, we know that Paul knows that the source of all those good qualities and actions come from God. He acknowledges it, and he is really ready to give credit where credit is due. All of us, Pharisee, tax collector, whoever we may be, possess the divine gift that urges us to call out to God and say, "Here I am," and I say a prayer, and to know that God is always listening, no matter how we say it. So now, here I am right now. I'm standing here, and I do have a beautiful prayer, which you might be familiar with. It's from the Jewish liturgy. It's entitled Evening Prayer for the Sabbath. I know it's morning, but we're speaking to God. In this moment of silent communion with thee, O Lord, a still small voice speaks in the depth of my spirit. It speaks to me of the things I must do to attain holy kinship with thee and to grow in the likeness of thee. I must do my allotted task with unflagging faithfulness, even though the eye of no taskmaster is on me. I must be gentle in the face of ingratitude, or when slander distorts my noblest motives. I must come to the end of each day with a feeling that I have used its gifts gratefully and faced its trials bravely. O Lord, help me to be ever more like thee, holy for thou art holy, loving for thou art love. Speak to me then, Lord, as I seek again and again in the stillness of meditation, until thy bidding shall at last become for me a hallowed discipline, a familiar way of life. Amen.